Caroline, I'm really excited about the individual we're going to have on today. It's perfect timing. Everybody's quote unquote busy, and it's kind of one of the 4-letter words I now hate in society. Like, how are things? Oh, I'm busy. Yeah, well, everybody's always busy, and I can speak for myself where I'm busy helping build out an organization, and I lead a lot of people, and I coach a traveling basketball team for my daughter, and it's always go, go, go. And, I've always given advice to other people around, making sure you take your holidays, make sure you take your time off, take care of your well-being. In BA, we always talk about the 3 pillars of people's well-being: their physical, their financial, and of course, their mental well-being. And I finally took a few days off to go away with my wife, and which was great. But I was so exhausted even when I got there, and I didn't realize how burnt I was. And, the importance of kind of, looking in sometimes, and because we talk to HR directors and CFOs and presidents of organizations all the time, and I see it all the time that more people are burnt and anxious than ever before, and they kind of want to get off that escalator that just keeps going faster and faster and faster. And, mental health is absolutely the new pandemic in society. There's not even a question if it is or it's not. And we're seeing disability claims go up. We've talked on podcasts about, 40% of new long-term disability claims are anxiety and burnout, right? Which wasn't even recognized as a mental illness by insurance companies, 10, 12 years ago. So really excited to have Dr. Ryan Todd on today. Well, so I know you've gotten to know Dr. Ryan a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And Rob, thank you for sharing that about yourself. It's interesting, right? Because we're day in and day out of this business. And as you said, we're all busy. And until, we really need to get to a point where we do something before we're exhausted. And it is easier said than done, but so glad you got away, that you took some time to, recognize that and recharge. It's so important. So today, what I'm really intrigued in, and yes, getting to know Dr. Ryan Todd from Headversity, is he's talking to us about the 4% of the resources that, if you can put that up front in preventative measures, will really help on the back end of productivity and mental health with employees. I know Benefits Alliance, it's so important to us as an association of expert advisors that we've invested and have such a passionate group of people that are part of our mental health and wellness committee. And we have carefully brought on preferred solution providers and people that we work with in our industry to hit all of the areas of preventative, when people are proactive with their mental health, right through mild to moderate to severe. This is what we're focusing on day in and day out. So as we do invite Dr. Todd in, I'm going to really encourage the audience. I know that we're going to put his recently released definitive guide to workforce mental health. That's the homework, folks, as you prepare to listen to and hear this podcast, is what's the 1 or 2 things that I'm going to learn about today and read about further to actually do something, rather than, status quo or feeling too overwhelmed to do something in the workforce. There's no option. You've got to do something if you want to have a healthy workforce. So let's bring in Dr. Todd, see what he has to teach us, and really engage with what he has, and take it to heart and take action.
Excited to have him in. Let's get him on board. So Dr. Ryan Todd, thank you for joining us today at the Benefits Alliance Voice podcast. It's great to have you on, and you've spoke before at our AGM last April in Toronto. So it's great to have a little one-on-one time with you today. So for the audience, why don't you give a quick background about yourself and what led you to starting your real unique organization called Headversity?
Yeah, so I'm a psychiatrist. I've been practicing now for about 6 or 7 years, but as it goes, you sort of train to be a psychiatrist for nearly a decade. For me, it was about, including undergrad, it's like 12 or 13 years of training. which is way too much. And most people probably did it quicker than I did. But when I landed at the hospital that I was at, I just had a massive wait list of patients, and you can kind of sense that people are, and the system is in a bit of chaos. And I don't think that's anyone's fault. It's just the way that the system has been put together. At the same time that I had finished my residency and I started as a staff doctor, I was doing a documentary on mental health in hockey. And being a Canadian and just a hockey fan, I always wanted to look at that intersection. This is also at the time when a lot of concussions were causing really severe mental health issues in prominent hockey players. So when those two forces came together, and I met Jordan, who's our co-founder, who has an education technology background, we felt like we could do something in media, in mental health, and have a impact in companies. The other thing that was happening is I was talking to all my patients who were coming in. I had a massive wait list. They'd have to wait 3-6 months to see me. I'd see them, and a lot of them are from the workplace. I'd ask, what do you have available in the workplace? They would say EAP. And I would say, do you use it? And they would say no. And so that was a really interesting thing, because when I started talking to HR directors, VP HR, CHROs, that was the gold standard of the mental health system in a company. And so there was this disconnect, right? We have this thing, this amazing EAP, but actually when you talk to people, people don't use it. A lot of people didn't particularly like it, depending on what EAP it was. And some are worse, some are better, but very underutilized. And this was it. And so this was also pre-pandemic. So we were not prepared as a society for what was going to hit us in terms of workplace mental health. We're seeing that now. That's where it came from. And we started Headversity, and we've just been trying to get better and better in terms of what we deliver in terms of preventative mental health ever since.
And, you made a couple of great points there. We've talked about this as advisors that, nationally, and we look after close to a couple million Canadians. And for the organizations that have an EAP, typically utilization is only still running around 8 to 11% annually, which I feel like that's been the stat for years. And considering, as you said, everything since the pandemic and just the rise of not only awareness, but the openness for people to talk about their mental health, you think this number would be 3 times higher.
Yeah.
So talk to us about some of those strategies that we think are very unique for companies with Headversity. What's kind of your secret sauce, and what's led to your success?
One, like a fundamental piece that is important to understand is that EAPs they weren't built for what they're used for today. Like when you think about the history of the EAP, they were really built for soldiers returning from World War II who had PTSD, alcohol use, and they were very much small, not-for-profit groups, community-based groups that could help employees get back to the workforce. Now, you fast forward many years, they went from small to regional to provincial, statewide to national. Now there's like 7 of them, and they're massive organizations. And what they are still used for is that crisis care, that if you need to talk to someone, do it. So the whole system has been set up where we call it a disincentive system. It's set up so that you don't use it in a lot of ways. I work for a large employer as a physician, and I'm in this space, I'm in this world, and it's hard for me to tell where that EAP is. And I think everyone's sort of okay with that. Why? Because the more you use it, the more you pay, right? There's that kind of conflict. There's that small disincentive. Also, we don't have enough practitioners to go around. A lot of EAPs, especially in the US, are going from, psychologists, master's level psychologists to like coaches. And that's okay for distribution of resources. But in terms of quality of care, it's really not okay. So that's the main thing that we came to realize is actually this gold standard is not gold at all. And there's a lot of work that is not being done that no one is talking about. And we're just saying, oh, there's a mental health crisis. Like, why are short-term disability costs 3x what they were last year? Why is everyone in this a teleprompter? Like, why is this such an expensive issue? And once you can embed that thinking into your organization, then you can sort of get behind, oh, we actually need prevention. We need to reskill people in the workplace. And there's some really practical things we can do to give people the skills to face the adversity that we inevitably are going to face in our workday.
And Dr. Todd, you've just released, in fact, and we'll have it in the show notes with this podcast, the definitive guide to workforce mental health. That is something you put a lot of time and effort. I loved reading through that with the case studies, but it right up front, you said one of the core challenges that you faced as a psychiatrist is helping a person get ahead of adversity. And ultimately, that's where this name of Headversity has come from, getting ahead of that. So that is different. It's working in a sea of employees to help people get ahead of adversity. So where do you start? Let's dive into some of the concepts of your definitive guide.
Yeah, I think we do such an excellent job of training employees in other skill sets. Like, if you're in back office, you know how to read a P&L, and you take years to develop that skill set, right? If you are in product design and like our company, you take years to develop a skill set on how to engineer product, how to code. And what we're seeing now is we actually don't have, and I would argue we've been de-skilled throughout the pandemic in really hardcore mental health skills, how to get proper sleep and really have good sleep hygiene, how to have a difficult conversation with a manager, how to manage conflict, how to put boundaries and understand your own mental health, how to create emotional recognition within yourself. These are hardcore mental health skills that if you don't have these, you really don't have much else, and you can't deploy those other skill sets. So I get often asked, where do we start? I always say start with leaders. Like if we could start with doing a quick educational session from our leaders. We've deployed a program called C.A.R.E, and it's a 30 to 40 minute interactive piece of learning, engaging learning that we roll out for leaders called Mental Health Foundations for Leaders. That is where all organizations should start, and that will become table stakes. Also because some of the legislation is catching up to where we're at as a society, and people are now understanding that's really important to train leaders on how to have a mental health conversation, how to understand your own levels of stress and burnout, how to put boundaries around work so that you can sustain your energy and sustain your work, how to recognize signs and symptoms in peers. Those 4 basic things, you can train your leaders on those things. That's where you start. And so one of the things that, I don't know, it sort of bothers me where HR directors are like, we don't know what to do. We don't know where to start. Super simple. Let's train leaders. And then we'll talk about adding to benefits. We'll talk about training the entire workforce. But leadership training has to be where we start along the journey.
Yeah, oh, that's a great place, because I did see in your paper there that, doing nothing is not an option. It can't be so overwhelming that you're doing nothing, even just doing something. And if it's just training leaders to start, that's probably the most powerful thing there. So Rob, I'll just quickly ask you too, from the advisor point of view, how is this resonating with you? Like, what are you hearing from employers? Like, do you get this a lot of like, we know we should be doing something when it comes to supporting mental health and wellness? This has been a conversation. It's not a new conversation, but do you find most are, still struggling with where to start?
Absolutely. I think that, a lot of companies have an employee assistance program. And for as Ryan was talking about as well, is kind of something that's been around for years and has been modified, especially from a pandemic standpoint. I don't think EAPs were set up to deal with everything we went through as a society, 4 years ago. And I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head there, Ryan, is that they don't know where to start. And, they'll say 2 things like, with a lot of HR specialists, some have taken courses around mental health training, which is amazing. But depending on the size of the organization, he or she could be wearing many hats, and sometimes they're afraid to ask the wrong question. And I think sometimes that's a mistake, just sometimes asking help for. So maybe why don't you guide us through a little bit of some of the strategies that you'll start with leaders, because as an example, somebody might have worked their way up in a company and now they're in kind of a managerial position, he or she, or a leadership. And, again, they might not have had this type of training. So where do you usually start with organizations when it comes like kind of step one, saying, hey, here's what's most important? And a lot of it can be just found open talking about it, with addressing it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think some groups now start with like stigma reduction. I actually don't think that's the thing anymore. Like especially in Canada, there are jurisdictions in the US and parts of the world where mental health is viewed very differently. But I don't think that stigma it's definitely not where it was 10 years ago. And that's a good thing. So stigma reduction, that's like super 20 years ago type of stuff. So I wouldn't start there because we're already there as a society. Like one example that I always give is people talking about seeing a therapist. Like everyone can talk about that openly. Do you remember when we were kids and you heard about somebody seeing a therapist or getting somebody having like a hospitalization because of mental health needs? It was earth shattering. The stigma was so strong. So I wouldn't start there. I do think, Rob, that it's important for us to start with how to have a mental health conversation. And we do that in this training, this Mental Health Foundations CERT that we roll out when we start working with organizations. Because it doesn't always help if just one or two leaders know how to do it. If everyone knows how to do it, then you can actually see cultural change. But it's as simple as this: training leaders on how to have a mental health conversation. I think we start there. And the framework that we use is called C.A.R.E, C-A.R.E, create time for the conversation, attend to the individual, AKA don't rush to fix that problem. R, respond and refer, create a respond and refer plan and say, if this gets worse, where do we turn to next? E, earmark time for a follow-up call. That's the modality that we teach. We can get into more depth. Leaders typically struggle with that A piece, attending. All leaders want to fix the problem right away. And we train to say, take a step back, ask open-ended questions, follow your curiosity, be attentive and validating, as opposed to what you do in your day job, which is like, oh, there's a problem, let's fix it right now. Mm-hmm. So care conversation, that's number one. The number two thing that we like to train is emotional recognition skills within yourselves as a leader. Because if you don't have that baseline emotional recognition, one, everyone else around you feels it, and that's just not good management. Two, you are at a significantly higher rate of burnout. And if we don't keep our leaders in the game, then everything else falls apart. But three, and most importantly, when you're able to identify negative emotions, and we have years of neuroimaging to show this, if you can identify, literally just say the negative emotion, it reduces activity in those fight, flight, or freeze areas of your brain. So it's simply we say name it to tame it. That's now become a well-known idiom, but there's neuroimaging to show that if you can name that emotion, it actually reduces the intense emotional experience that brings that emotion. So one, care conversation. Two, let's train our leaders on recognizing emotions within themselves.
Well, I think that's a fantastic way to start, right? People got to look inside before you can help somebody on the outside, right? So that's such a great key point. You wrote in your paper about 3 areas of intervention that, from a clinical standpoint, and maybe you could talk us about that. So some of the different areas within kind of recognizing from a mental health standpoint. I'd love you to focus a little bit on that for people.
Yeah, the genesis of this was like people are, for whatever reason, really interested in what we learn in medical school and like how we're taught as residents. And I think that's not a good thing. I think doctors have benefited for years from that like power differential and the Grey's Anatomy, like opening up the door to this medical world. But I love to share the stuff that we're taught, how we're taught to think, how we're taught to process complex information. And this is a paradigm that's been around for 100 years. But the punchline of this story that we don't like to say is that doctors are not really that important when it comes to community health and when it comes to massive things that are happening in society on the medical side. We're actually the least important people. So we don't like to admit it, but it's true. We have years of evidence to show this. How we think about complex topics like alcohol use in a community or diabetes care or tuberculosis or COVID, like widespread epidemic, pandemic type items that we're dealing with. Mental health is one of those right now that we're all grappling with thinking about. How we think about it as clinicians and medical doctors and researchers is we break these complex things down into 3 areas: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and what we call tertiary prevention. Okay, I'll start with tertiary prevention because that's kind of the tricky nomenclature. Tertiary prevention, that person has active symptoms. The horse is out of the barn. We are trying to get the horse back in the barn, reduce symptoms, trying to stop it from getting worse. Okay, and when we think about a common example like diabetes, that would be like that person has elevated blood glucose. They have diabetes. They are on insulin. They are now getting foot care or vision care or stroke prevention care. That's tertiary. That area, by the way, is where society spends 96% of our resources. Hospitals, doctors, emergency rooms, EAPs. That's where we put all of our money. What we know, though, is that 4% of the resources go into the primary and secondary budget. We also know that if you shift resources, that's when you can have a significant impact on a societal medical issue. And I'll give you an example that's famous in epidemiology world and that we're trying to bring to the workplace. And it's tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, circa 1908, we are seeing some data gathering around it. Like, what is tuberculosis? It was called consumption at the time. How does it work? What do we think about it? How do we actually treat it? Now, that was the data gathering kind of early stage of epidemiologists, physicians like myself, trying to get on top of it and see what we can do. Okay. What we see over the next 80 years is a massive reduction in tuberculosis rates, right? And the state that this was studied in, most in particular, was Massachusetts. And then the data is correlated across North America. A massive reduction. Like, we're talking a 98% reduction in tuberculosis over 80 years.
Wow.
Okay. So that 98% reduction happens. And then what do we think happens when tuberculosis is almost eradicated from society? The vaccine comes out. Okay. And then we have like a 98% go to 99% reduction. And now it's nearly eradicated across North America. But what we think about as a society, is the vaccine. Of course, there's the vaccine. There's the technology. Like, we spent all these years putting money into the vaccine and the technology. But what we ignore is that 98% of the impact of eradicating this disorder was from education, upskilling people in terms of hand washing, isolating when you get sick, proper nursing care, proper long-term care and home care. These are core things that we can do that are easy, but they're not sexy technology expensive things. So they don't get that 96% of the funding, but they work. And this is the paradigm that I would like us to focus on when we're looking at the workplace mental health crisis right now.
So much of healthcare traditionally has been reactive versus proactive, right? That's so much of, we talk about our healthcare system just in general, as you just talked about there. I think it's a great analogy, whether it's from mental health or if, you're in a car accident. Best part of this country is, someone's hopefully going to call 911. You're going to get great care. You're going to get looked after, great reactive, right? It's that proactive. So I love that. I love that philosophy around, proactive mental health. And, a lot of people have viewed, and you've advertised Headversity as a pre-EAP. So a lot of people listening might say, well, I've already got an EAP, but this is kind of unique. Talk to us about what makes your organization unique, as a preventative measure versus reactive measure. Ryan?
Yeah, it's what we focus on is 100% prevention. So that primary and secondary. If we get into the weeds a little bit as to what primary is, that's before any symptoms are appearing, right? That's before there's no signs or symptoms of burnout. There's no psychological safety claims in that company. We're totally focused on prevention, and we focus a lot on that. And then there's this secondary bucket, which is really interesting. That's when symptoms are starting to appear in a person. Maybe they're starting to get burnt out and they need to go to Turks and Caicos like Rob did for our listeners today.
Send me back.
Maybe we're starting to see employee NPS scores degrade in the company. Maybe we're seeing an increase in short-term disability costs. These are secondary. So the horse is starting to leave the barn. We're trying to prevent that from getting worse. Okay, so what Headversity focuses on in its simplest form is training employees, giving these skills back to them, these skills that they deserve through a learning platform called Headversity. Now, we have a couple of experiences. One is called Headversity Solo. That is an experience that's personalized to you. You answer a couple of questions. You put yourself on a pursuit. It's gamified, so you can you can get experience points. You can also go on a hot streak of simply just practicing. Like for me, I do some physical exercise every day. I do that resilience training every day. So that's solo. That's purely primary prevention. And we see really high adoption across companies and really good engagement because of the interactivity. That secondary part is really important, and we call that social learning. So we had a realization a couple of years ago into this journey. So much of the corporate learning is done in social settings. Whether that's somebody saying, hey, everyone, do a CERT. I'm a leader. We believe in mental health. We're all going to take 30 minutes and do this foundational training. That's social. Or we have a meeting, an HR meeting or a finance meeting, and we're gathered on Zoom or we're gathered around the boardroom table. So much of our learning is social. So we created a platform called Team that can help leaders facilitate a quick 5 to 7 minute training during those meetings. Because the third thing that we realized that was so crucial to Headversity and the impact that we want to have is you can't tack on another thing. Everyone's busy. Everyone's stressed. We can't take this out of the flow of work. We have to integrate with Microsoft Teams. We have to integrate into your LMS. We have to make it easy to access and a click of a button to do a short training. And that's what we've done. I think that's the thing that's differentiated us is we've really leaned into short-based in the flow of work training.
Yeah. And Dr. Todd, like when I think about, like you said, the generations and getting people used to practicing preventative, that is so key because we're used to, at least my generation and maybe above, is okay, you go seek medical attention when the horse is out of the barn, and there's where the doctors come into play is I feel bad. I've reached a point where I have to admit that I feel bad, whether it's physically, mentally, otherwise, and go do something about it. So this shift for preventative is so key. And we need to be taught. We need to be taught how to be preventative, just like we go to the gym to prevent, down the line injury or just, keep those good feelings happening. So when I think about this further, teaching the leaders of organizations to proactively even spot or have these proactive conversations, you mentioned earlier about how individuals have become deskilled. So you're kind of learning about that and then learning what to watch for. So if I think about my daughter and her generation at school, I'll just give you a brief example. I love that now when I ask my daughter a question of like, how are you feeling today? She knows it's okay. I'm not okay today. I've had that answer, not frequently, but she's okay with being honest with that. And I love that. So that transition through the generations is happening. But yeah, I really want to hone in on what is it that we're deskilled in? What is it the generations and post-COVID, what have we forgotten of how to do and how do we spot that as a manager?
I think there's two big areas. One is conflict, and the other one's mindfulness. Now, these are hardcore mental health skills that we want to train in everyone, but when we think about how I grew up versus my kids, how they're growing up, I have two youngsters. They're 7 and 5 now. I would wait for the bus. That was a moment of mindfulness. Okay. I would walk to school. That was mindfulness. I would rewind the VCR tape after watching a movie that I went to Blockbuster to buy. These are things that you wait for patiently, and you're just thinking. And I grew up in a small town, so I got to just think and explore my psychic world, as psychiatrists would say. And that's mindfulness training. We don't have that anymore. You wait for the bus, 100 out of 100 people are on their phone. There's no such thing as please be kind and rewind. That sticker doesn't exist anymore. There's no walking to things without being on your phone or listening to a podcast. So we just have literally stripped away our ability to just exist and think. And our brains are really built for what we call in psychiatry and physiology a resting state. We have removed that resting state recovery from the brain. And then we wonder why everyone's so tired all the time, because we've taken away the ability for the brain just to rest and think and process our days. So I think that's a core skill that we have to force now, right? We have to, it's sort of like when we were all kind of walking before cars. And now we have cars in public transportation. Now we have to build gyms so people can actually exercise. Now we're building these cognitive gyms so people can exercise these mindfulness skills. The other one I think is conflict. We've reduced our ability and the opportunity to have difficult conversations. Again, thinking about where I grew up on the streets of a small town, right? You would go outside and you'd come back for dinner. And what you did is you would deal with conflict with other kids, like the bully, or the youngster who wants to borrow your hockey stick and you don't want to give it to him. That's conflict, and you deal with that. What I noticed when I was a young adult is we were already starting to de-skill our ability to do that. And what happened? We were starting to deal with conflict this way, with emojis and text messaging, and then that escalated because we have Messenger now, and we have now just social media. And my niece, for example, who's recently entered the workforce, told me that she has she has sent between the age of 12 and 21 over 700,000 messages on Snapchat. And she said she is a low use individual for this application.
Wow.
Constantly snapping pictures, sending them to their friends, and they send them to 10 or 20 friends. Now, our way of communicating and dealing with conflict has changed. Where is that showing up? It's in the workplace. And where we're really showing up, where I think the bullet is hitting the bone here, is when there is a conflict now, instead of dealing with it, we might text about it, but we also might take a mental health day. We also might just stay at home that day. We also might avoid that conversation for a month. We also might just quit that workplace. So that's where it's actually showing up. So if I could restore 2 hardcore mental health skills, as I call them, 1, mindfulness, 2, how to have a sticky, tough sandpaper conversation, how to work through that as a team, that's been entirely de-skilled, and we need to return that. We're seeing the deleterious effects of that right now.
Yeah. I got to share a quick story on the de-skilling of myself when it comes to mindfulness. I was recently at a spa where you are not allowed to speak. And that's very difficult for me. I'm a chatty person. And I got into that sauna, and it was a good solid 10 minutes of extreme discomfort for me, where you're just listening to literally silence and there's everyone around you. But it really did force my brain to just turn off and relax and not go to the phone or not feel like I had to talk to people. And after I got through that uncomfortableness, I did feel, at the end of that whole day, relaxing and actually thinking more clearly. And that's just my personal experience. And I'm someone that would have been trained for years about, waiting for the bus or waiting for the rewinding of the tape. I think the most I allow myself to think is while I wait for my toast in the toaster these days. so very, very important, Dr. Todd. Yeah.
So funny you say that too. I was thinking two things. There's a whole bunch of people listening going, what's a VCR? And that hurts a little bit, knowing that I'm old enough to remember those conversations where we walked the Blockbuster and he'd be excited because it was a new release day. And you had to think about it. And then you had to have an open up conversation because we didn't have an iPhone stuck to our hand. And two, I'm thinking about a whole generation, my teenage kids included, that are going to be like me, going to have carpal tunnel thumbs before they're 25 because of 700,000 texts. And, I think it's only going to get worse. So when you talk about some of these strategies, Ryan, now from an implementation standpoint, are these practices that you're looking, that you recommend that people and organizations, like how much time should they spend on it? Is this a daily practice for people? Is this a once a month? I find traditionally that, if you run just an employee meeting, everybody hears it and then they go back to their busy day. So how has your organization kind of fought that, knowing that that's a typical thing that will happen? Run an employee meeting, people have to hear, that's nice, loved hearing about it. And then it's out of sight, out of mind. So what are some strategies Headversity's focused on doing?
We've implemented this C.A.R.E model so that everyone can get around a foundational training around either respect in the workplace, psychological safety in the workplace, mental health foundations, and then the other one's mental health foundations for leaders. So we will start an organization off with one of those certs. What that does is it communicates that we take this issue seriously, and we're making it voluntary, involuntary, like everyone's doing it. We're all on the same page. We're all learning this foundational language. What that gives everyone is an ability to talk about it when an issue arises. So somebody says something that's offside, we have language to be an upstander, to say, I didn't really like how that came out, and let's talk about it, right? We see a colleague who's struggling. We have language to talk about it, right? We're not afraid to approach that person, have an open and honest conversation with them. So you need that foundational language, or literally nothing happens. And then where we've found a high level of effect is if we can get everyone on Headversity solo, and then have little gentle push notifications. Everyone is on their personal journey, but it has to be two things: really short form, like 3 minutes, and it has to be in the flow of work. So an example that I like to use is I do an optimism practice every evening because I get a little reminder. And if I don't keep on my hot streak, you get a little nudge from Headversity to say, practice mindfulness and practice optimism. So I literally reflect on 3 positive things at the end of the day. That's just my routine now. And that inoculates me from all of the negativity that I see on all the news channels, on my Google News feed, on the radio. Everything is negative, negative, negative. And we have a lot to be grateful for. So that helps me. That's part of my mental health practice. But it has to be 2 things, Rob. It has to be short form. And we're talking like 2 to 3 minute practices, or no one's going to do it, because 5 minutes seems like a lifetime right now. And 2, it has to be in the flow of work. How we do that is we integrate with other platforms that exist. Microsoft Teams is our most popular integration. So you pull up Teams, you got a little push notification to practice a bit of a mental health piece. The other thing that we've really focused on is once you are certified in that skill, let's say mental health foundations, you over time get a little push notification every quarter to practice, learn a little more, stay qualified in that skill. And we took that from the CPA world. We took that from the advisor world. You get certified as an advisor, as a CPA, as a physician even, but you need to do ongoing credits to stay alive, to stay certified and qualified. So we've taken that model and implemented it into mental health training.
It's all around personal development, right? People talk about personal development at work and, personal development for you. Yeah. I think that's great. You build it like a routine, like brushing your teeth every day, then it becomes a habit. So it's just been great. It's been amazing.
And prevention, like you said, works. If it's 96% of resources go into reactive, this 4%, to invest in the preventative. So overall, we've talked today about how people have, become deskilled. We've talked about how prevention works, this 4% up front. And finally, how, really, really came to light, even when you said, doctors at the end of the day are important, but what really makes an impact can actually be the frontline managers. So training is important. So for myself, I'll ask like one final question of you, Dr. Todd. Anything else you want to make sure, that motivate people to dive into your definitive guide to workforce mental health? What else would you want to make sure the listeners today hear that can help them, create a plan for their employees at work?
Yeah, I think people get intimidated by the topic. And so we've tried to make it really approachable and easy to start, because once organizations start, you can't stop, because it reduces costs, it reduces all the bad outcomes like absenteeism, and it improves culture. And that's all we ever want, right? Is to come to a place that we like getting out of bed in the morning and come to work and enjoy the people that we work with. That's really all anyone wants at the end of any day. So we've tried to just reduce every single barrier to learning and understanding this topic, because for years, like literally 100 years, we've kept it protected. We've kept that power differential as physicians. We like using scary language and acronyms that no one understands, because if I understand it and you don't, that's good for physicians. That's good for the medical world. We're trying to democratize this and make it super low barrier and easy to read, easy to ingest, and easy to start for HR people. So that's the takeaway that I want folks to leave with, is we've made it super simple to start, and we've made it all evidence-based, so you don't have to worry about this not working or worry about eye rolls at the boardroom table. This is an eye roll free zone, and it's really easy to get into it.
And you know what, from an advisor standpoint, the cost is not a barrier to adding Headversity into any corporate platform. So, we appreciate you being on with us today. I think our audience has learned a lot that is looking for options and solutions, and just probably a place to start if they haven't started yet around implementing some type of mental health strategy in their workforce. So Ryan, we really appreciate you being on today. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Caroline. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you. This has been the Benefits Alliance Voice. If you've enjoyed this podcast with Dr. Ryan Todd, please go ahead and share it with your network, and check out the show notes for the very interesting definitive guide to workforce mental health.